Hello, everyone. My name is Eric Eichhoff, and I serve in the Office of Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. We're excited that you and your family are joining us for this session of JCU Jr, a program for kids. This summer, John Carroll launched JCU Jr, a new online programming focusing on the youngest members of the Blue Shirt community, children of our alumni, faculty, staff, and friends of John Carroll. We invite our families to explore science, the arts, and your kitchen as we offer programs that will keep your children's interest and keep their minds engaged. Today, we are focusing on the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the women's suffrage movement. We're incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Malia McAndrew with us today to explore this area with us. Dr. Malia McAndrew is an associate history professor in the Department of History at John Carroll University. She specializes in the history of women and gender in the United States. Dr. McAndrew holds a PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park, and has taught at John Carroll since 2008. During the 2018-19 academic year, she was awarded a visiting scholar appointment at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. Dr. McAndrew is the author of several scholarly articles. Her publications have appeared in the Journal of Women's History, the Magazine of History, and other academic outlets. Dr. McAndrew's most recent scholarship chronicles the life of Lieutenant Ethel B. Weed, a Cleveland native who is one of the few American women to devise and implement U.S. foreign policy during the U.S. military occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952. Working along noted Japanese feminist Lieutenant Weed helped bring suffrage and a robust participation in the political process to Japanese women for the first time in that nation's history. At John Carroll, Dr. McAndrew is on the faculty steering committees for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, and the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program, and the Asian Studies program. In 2017, she served as a historical consultant and interviewee for the PBS of the Western Reserve documentary, The Battle for the Right to Vote. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McAndrew.
Hi, Carroll kids. It's another edition of JCU Jr, and we have a great topic for you today, because today is the 100th anniversary of something very special. Do you know what it is? I've got a hint for you right up here. What does this say? Votes for Women. Votes for Women was the slogan of a group of people called suffragettes. And what suffragettes wanted to do was simply that, get women the ability to vote in the United States. Because all the way from 1776 to 1920, women didn't have that right. In fact, they didn't have a lot of rights in the United States. So, for example, women didn't have the right to own property for a lot of US history. If they wanted something like a house or a bike, they had to have their father or their husband put it in his name. Women didn't have the ability to do things like go to school because there weren't a lot of schools that allowed women to go to them. And girls weren't even really encouraged to do things like learn how to read. So there were a lot of things in US society that needed changed. But it was hard for women to change them because they didn't have the right to vote. So for many years, between 1776 and 1920, hundreds of women and men banded together to change this. And in 1920, 100 years ago, we had one of the largest mobilizations of new voters in the United States. This suffrage movement changed America forever. It changed it for the better. So maybe we should look at the past and we should look at what were some of the strategies that people in the past used to change their world. And maybe we can look at them and we can think about how we want to change our world today. So what I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to give you 3 strategies that the suffragettes used to change America for the better. And I want you to think about what were the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these strategies. And if you were alive during this time period, if you were alive in 1850 or 1890 or 1900, which of these strategies do you think you would have adopted? Which one would have spoken most to you? Okay, so get out your pen and paper, crayons, whatever you want, and take some notes, because at the end of this video, in addition to learning about 3 strategies, I'm also going to give you 3 challenges based on everything that you've learned. And we'll see if you can complete the 3 challenges. Okay? So Let's talk about the three strategies first. All right. Number one strategy that the suffragettes used was a state-by-state approach. What they said is, let's go into states and let's try and get the right for women to vote just in this state alone. Let's not worry about the national level. Let's get women the ability to vote inside these states. And then hopefully, if we can get this state and that state and this state and that state all to give women the right to vote, we can achieve national suffrage that way. And so they did this. They went door to door in local states. They went to state fairs. They went to places where people were gathered. In Massachusetts, there was even a group of women who got on trolleys. And as the trolley went around the different stations, when it stopped at the station, they would shout, "Votes for women," and they would give an impromptu speech all about why women should have the right to vote in that state. So this strategy was effective. It had strengths, and we're going to talk about the strengths and the weaknesses, because a number of states did allow women to vote in state elections. So Wyoming was the first in 1890, then Colorado, then Utah, then Idaho, and a number of states followed. But what do you think the weakness of this strategy would be? Why might some people criticize this strategy? What do you think? Okay, well, one thing some people would say is that the state-by-state approach, it just takes too long. You have to go step by step by step, and that takes forever. So for example, between 1870 and 1910, there were 480 different tiny little campaigns all over the United States trying to secure women's right to vote. And only 17 of those campaigns basically were elevated to the state level where the state legislature voted on this issue of women's rights. And of those 480 campaigns that turned into 17 statewide referendums, only 2 states in that entire time period ended up granting women's right to vote. So some people would just say the state-by-state approach, it took too long, all right? And so that's why some people were drawn to approach number 2. And approach number 2 is the national approach. And these people said, hey, listen, we live in one country. We have one constitution. And I think we need to focus our intention on the national right for women to vote. And some people went as far as saying, you know what, I think the Constitution already guarantees me the right to vote. I'm going to go and I'm going to register to vote in my local election. I'm going to even support a woman to become president of the United States. Did you know that women ran to be president of the United States even back in the 19th century? So these women with this national approach, they wanted one national solution to this problem. Now, one of the problems that they first faced is that the courts struck down some of their actions. They said that the Constitution doesn't guarantee you the right to vote, and so you're going to have to make a national amendment to the Constitution if you want women to vote in the United States. And so they did this. They helped to put into motion what was called the 19th Amendment that said that the national government cannot discriminate against people on the basis of sex, on the basis of if they are a woman. And so in order for this 19th Amendment to be ratified, in order for it to become part of the Constitution, not only did Congress have to vote for it, 75% of the states had to vote for it. And so this national campaign went out for this to be ratified and for women everywhere in the United States to have the right to vote all at once. Okay, now let's go back to our strengths and our weaknesses. What do you think the strengths of this approach were? We've already said a little bit. One amendment, it assures everybody the legal right to vote. So that's kind of a strength. Any other strengths you can think of? And then weaknesses. What would be the weakness of a national approach? Why do you think some people would have critiqued a national approach? Well, one reason is that some people thought that the national approach would cause a lot of backlash. You need 75% of the states to ratify this amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. But what about those 25% of the states that didn't ratify it? Would they be resentful against women? Would they say, that's it, we don't care about your laws, we're not going to follow your Constitution? There was a fear by some people that if you made a national law before individual places had settled it in their own communities, people might backlash and rebel against it just because the federal government was saying you had to do it. And so some people were skeptical of the national approach for that reason. Now, let's talk about the third strategy. Strategy number one, state by state, and strategy number two, the national approach, they both worked inside the system of government. They played by the same rules that everybody had always played by. What strategy number three really wanted to do was play the game of suffrage outside the box, right? And that strategy was one of national attention. They thought that working within the system was simply not going far enough. And so they wanted to draw attention. They actually wanted to draw attention at the national level and at the local level and everywhere that they could get it by participating in public acts of protest. So they would parade down the city's streets and they would carry signs that said votes for women. They would go in front of the White House and they would picket the White House and they would say, Mr. President, when are you going to support votes for women, right? And many of these women actually got arrested for protesting because in many cases, the police said that they were doing things like obstructing traffic. And the women said, we're not doing anything wrong. You're only arresting us because you disagree with our political opinions. And then they refused to pay the fines that they were giving for obstructing traffic. And they were sent to jails. They were sent to things called workhouses back then. And in these places, they had to live in dirty and dingy conditions. And they were given food that was like worm infested. And when they were inside these prisons, these jails, one of the things that they did was they went on a hunger strike, that they wanted to keep getting attention, right? That was the purpose of their hunger strike. They wanted people to say, oh my gosh, people are refusing to eat. They won't take any food. We all need food. So what could be so important that these women are refusing to eat? And so that they hoped to bring attention to their cause. And they did this. They were successful in this. So my question to you again is, what do you think would be a strength and a weakness of this approach? What do you think? Well, in some ways, it could go either way for these women. Some people saw their passion and were drawn more to them because they were doing types of things that women didn't do during this time period. Women were mostly living inside their homes. So the fact that there were women out in the streets marching and protesting, that attracted a lot of people to the movement, right? But some of these protests, there was a backlash to them. And some of the backlash is because oftentimes things would devolve in some cities. They devolved into riots in some cities. And some people started to think that these women's activists, that they weren't disciplined, that they were turning people away from the movement, that people said, they were too militant, that they were rabble rousers. And they even started to make some of the other women who were doing strategy number 1 and 2, and they made them seem more reasonable, right? So some people, they liked that the women were out there opening people's eyes, grabbing their attention. And some people were really kind of put off by the cause for those reasons, all right? So we've gone through 3 strategies. Can you remember what those 3 strategies are? Because I told you, you're gonna have a challenge now, and your challenge is based on those 3 strategies. So let's name them. Let's say them backwards, okay? So the first strategy that we talked about was, we said some women, or it was the last, but now we'll talk about it first. We said some women, they wanted to just draw attention to the cause by doing things that were unexpected, okay? So your challenge number 1, to help us celebrate the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote in the United States, is I want you and your entire family to dress up in women's suffrage colors. So the women's suffrage activists, they wanted like a brand. They wanted a flag to represent them. And so they made a flag, and it had 3 colors, and the colors were white, purple, and yellow. And so I want everybody in your family to dress up in these 3 colors and take a picture. Go and Zoom your grandma. Stand in your front yard or have a picnic. And when people see you all dressed in the same colors, they're gonna say, what's going on? What are you guys supporting, a new football team or something? And you'll tell them no. You'll say, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women voting in the United States. And we're taking these women's actions and we're inspired by them, right? One of the reasons that they picked these colors is actually pretty interesting. You can tell people some of the things that you learned about today. So for instance, they took the white because during that time period, a lot of men wore like dark colored suits and dark colored hats, like black or gray. And so that marching down the street in white would really, would be like a pop of white, and it would really contrast, and so that you could really see them really well. And so that's one of the reasons they wore white. They wore yellow or gold because they saw it as like the sun, like they were bringing light to the world. And then they also wore purple because they thought it was a color of loyalty, and they had loyalty to each other and they had loyalty to the movement. So I want you and your family to, everybody's got a white t-shirt somewhere, right? Maybe you've got some purple socks, a yellow hat. Get everybody in the house dressed in women's rights colors and take a picture and share it with the world. Draw attention to this topic and to this 100th anniversary that we're celebrating today. So that's challenge number 1. Okay, challenge number 2, we said that there was a national approach. So what I want you to do is I want you to pick a national issue that is really important to you. And remember how I told you that the women's rights activists had their flag and it had those 3 colors? Well, it also had stars on it. And every time a new state decided to ratify women's rights, they would sew another star on the flag. And they would sew another star, and they would sew another star until 100 years ago, August 18th, 1920, Tennessee was the last state that they needed. And so they had won women's suffrage. They had amended the Constitution. So they took that flag and they put it out their window, and it fell from the 2nd floor all the way down to the 1st floor. And again, it was drawing attention to this national issue. And each of those stars represented the people in the states who had an interest in changing America. So again, to your challenge. Challenge number 2 is that you pick a national issue, and I want you to draw a picture of the suffrage flag. You can find a picture of it online, and I want you to put it in the window of your house. And then next to that, I want you to draw another flag, and I want you to put another star on that flag. And you can decorate this flag however you want, because this flag is for you. This flag is about an issue that you care passionately about. What's a national issue that you care passionately about? Do you care about the environment? Do you care about hunger, homelessness? What do you want to help change in America? Because all of these women's activists, they fought for so many years. And finally things changed. So somebody has to start thinking about today the things we want to change. So in your window, we're going to honor these women activists with their flag, but they are just a reminder to us that there are other things that need changed in our own society. So I want you to make your own flag. If you make the environmental flag, maybe you'll make your star green. I don't know. I would love to see a picture of the flag that you eventually make, right? But it has to be a national issue that you care deeply about. All right. So challenge number 3, all right? We said that a lot of the suffragettes focused their time on local issues, and local issues are important, right? Of course, when November 3rd comes around, when election day comes around this year, everybody's going to vote for who they want to be US president, right? Everybody talks about who they want to be president. But guess what? There are going to be other things on the ballot as well. There are going to be things that affect your local community. And I know you don't have the right to vote in the United States, but women didn't wait for the right to vote in order to care about the types of things that were going on in their local communities. So what I want you to do is I want you and your parents to research what is on your ballot that affects your local community. All you have to do is Google the name of your local county election board. So Cuyahoga County or Monroe County or whatever county that you live in. Just Google the election board, and you can oftentimes get a list of everything that's going to be voted on election day. And so maybe it's local public school quality, maybe it's public transportation, maybe it's job training programs, maybe it's public safety. I want you and your parents to find something on that ballot that you want to investigate, you want to learn about. And then I want you to tell your parents what your opinion is. I want you to tell them how you think they should vote. Even though you don't have the right to vote, you have the right to be involved in this country and the types of debates and conversations that we have. All right. So we're going to draw attention. You're going to make your picture, take your picture with everybody in your family, find them that purple, yellow, and white clothing. Then you're going to make your star for your own national issue. And then third, you're going to find a local issue and you're going to educate yourself and your parents on it. So those are your three challenges. I know it's big, but I think you're up to it. And I mean, again, I think you want to take the inspiration of these suffragettes who we're celebrating today, because for 144 years, women didn't have the right to vote in the United States. And then overnight, all of a sudden, they did, right? On November 2nd, 1920, 8 million women voted. This is the largest increase in the voter rolls in US history, right? So let's take them as our inspiration. Let's learn from the past. Let's look at the strategies. Let's look at their weaknesses, their strengths. Let's learn from them, and let's try and change our own society, all right? So with that, I'll take your questions.
Thank you so much for this thoughtful look into the suffrage movement and how the battle for women's right to vote was fought and won. We did receive a handful of questions for you and would love to know your thoughts on them. So Lauren, who is age 10, was wondering who some of the prominent suffragists were, especially if there were any influential Black leaders in the movement. And then what did the suffrage movement look like in Northeast Ohio?
That's a great question, Lauren. There are so many different suffragettes who you could learn and study about on your own time. If you want to think about Northeast Ohio, there was a really prominent National Women's Rights Convention in 1851, and a famous woman by the name of Sojourner Truth, one of the most prominent suffragettes, gave a really famous speech there. Sojourner Truth was born a person who was enslaved. And a lot of people during this time period used to say that women were too delicate to vote. Women were too dainty to vote. And Sojourner Truth is known in Northeast Ohio. She gave a famous speech where she said, hey, listen, nobody ever treated me dainty. Nobody ever treated me as if I couldn't do difficult things. And she called people out and said that women are capable of all things that men are capable of in terms of voting, definitely. And so she would be a really prominent African-American female who was also a suffragette, who you might want to study some more. Some other African-American women might be women like Nannie Helen Burroughs is a very interesting person who fought for women's suffrage and for rights in the South. Mary Church Terrell. Some women from some other groups you might want to look at would be like women like Alice Paul or Susan B. Anthony. So there are tons and tons of suffragettes to look at, and yeah, have fun and explore on the computer.
Great, thank you. Eliana actually had something similar to that. She was wondering, was the suffragette movement or the movement to the right to vote, was that one person's idea or was that a collective group idea, and they worked together, or how did that all come together, work together as a group?
Ever since the United States was founded, there were women who were talking about their desire to have the vote. And so many different women had this idea independently and started sharing these ideas with each other. And it eventually came together into the women's rights movement. But even as early as the American Revolution, women like Abigail Adams were writing letters to her husband, who became president of the United States, saying that women will foment a revolution if they're completely left out of the laws that govern the United States. So it was a broad-based idea that came from a lot of different quarters.
She also had a quick question about how they organize in a time when they don't have the technology that we have today. So if they couldn't email stuff or post it on Facebook, how were they, what were they using to make sure that they were organizing and moving forward in the same direction?
That's a great question because they didn't have Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or any other app or anything else on the computer. Computers hadn't been invented. Even TVs hadn't been invented. Even radios hadn't been invented. So how did they organize? Well, they did have newspapers. They had printed newspapers. And so people would have organized events and they would publicize them in newspapers. But also women would get and they would go into the streets and they would hand out pamphlets. They would hand out flyers advertising their events. And then on a personal level, because I think a lot of people share information on social media because they want to share it with their friends. One of the things that people used to do a lot back then is they used to write letters to each other. So let's say you had an idea about how to push forward women's suffrage. Maybe you would write that idea in a letter to your mom. Your mom would get the idea, she would love it, and she would want other people to know. She would take your letter and maybe she would pass it on to her cousin. And then her cousin and her cousin's family would read your letter and then they would pass it on to somebody else. So people used to use letter writing networks. So that might be something you could even try yourself someday when you don't have school. Maybe you could write some letters to your cousins and see if you could get a letter writing chain going.
Brielle was wondering, what, if any, voting rights did women have before the 19th Amendment was ratified and passed? And how did those rights influence the women's suffrage movement?
That's a great question, Brielle, because we've been talking just about the history of the United States. But actually, if you look at the much longer history, the history of North America, which spreads back some 10,000 years, there were a number of women who voted in North America, and they voted as members of Native American groups. And there are different places where people had different amounts of power. It wasn't the same in every single nation. But like if you're tuning in from the area that is like upstate New York, like Buffalo area or any of those regions, that was one of the places in North America where there was a group called the Haudenosaunee Confederation. And they were an incredibly powerful nation, a confederation of nations. And women in that community had the ability to deliberate, to vote in council, and they could, even if they were upset with a chief, they could kick him out of office. So women's suffrage in North America goes back some 10,000 years. It's really nothing new.
Sienna was wondering, how effective was the passage of the 19th Amendment in actually achieving equality in voting rights between men and women?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I think it gets back to our question about tactics and like how effective are various tactics. If people have hate in their heart against you, in some ways, it doesn't matter what the law says. So for a lot of women, even though women had won the right to vote in 1920, some women still weren't able to vote. So for example, Native American women, who we just mentioned, weren't able to vote in the United States until the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 specifically said that Native American women were born in the United States, were U.S. citizens too, and could vote in elections. Another example would be African American women and African American men. Even though they had the legal right to vote, many people didn't want to see them vote. And so they came up with all these crazy barriers that they put in their way. So it wasn't until the 1954 Civil Rights Act that many African American women were actually able to vote. And then to go to the crux of your question, there's a lot more just besides voting that women want to be able to do. And so you see every generation of women in the United States push the ball forward in new ways and help to get more rights for women. So they called in the 1920s, what they call it is the first wave of women's movements in the United States. Like if you imagine you're at the beach and here comes the first wave, but then you just wait around a while and another wave will come. So another prominent wave was like in the 1960s and 70s, where women fought for equality in the courts, and they fought for equality to do things like have a job and not be discriminated against, and to pay an equal wage, be paid an equal wage, the same as men. And now even in our own generation today, there are more women again pushing for women's rights. And so every generation continues to improve the struggle and to push the ball forward.
Thank you. Kylie was wondering what you felt or feel is the most successful strategy that the suffragettes employed in order to pursue and achieve the passage of the 19th Amendment.
Oh, Kylie, that's such a good question. I don't know. I can't decide. They were all so good, and they all really, every voice was needed. Every voice was needed to contribute. I mean, I like to think about, as I asked you, is like, if you were living during that period, which strategy would you have used? Which one would you have been drawn to? And the truth is that we need every voice, and everybody has a different skill set. Everybody has a different way of interacting with the world. So I really think that all strategies are effective, and you have to figure out what's the right strategy for you.
And then finally, as you had mentioned in the program, we have an election coming up. And Emily was wondering what girls and women can do to ensure that all women cast a vote in November.
I remember one of my earliest memories was I asked my dad if I could go and vote with him. And so that's one thing that you could do. Now, some people might be voting from their houses this year. Some people might be going to polling centers. And it's a little bit tricky because the virus makes it unsafe for some people to travel outside their house. But so if you can't physically travel to vote with your parents, certainly talk to them, tell them, encourage people in your family, start local, right? Start with the people around you and make sure that they're voting, and ask them if they've voted, and ask them if they've thought about the things that they're voting about. So I would say that's the most important way, is just to talk to people, to remind them that the election is coming up, and to tell them that you're excited to learn the results of this national election that we have coming up soon.
Awesome. And then finally, I had this question. I know in our family, we were trying to learn a lot about the movement and how, we're trying to achieve more full equality. If families wanted to learn more about the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the suffragettes, the fight for equality, where would you recommend they go to find resources on and books on these topics?
Yeah, there are so many really good resources that are available online today. And so you can look into Google, but I would recommend you especially look at like the national parks. And so nonprofit organizations funded by taxpayers. So look at the National Women's History Museum, for example. Today is the 100th anniversary of the day that Tennessee signed or ratified the 19th Amendment. But next week on the 26th, that's the 100th anniversary of when the amendment actually was written and was brought into law. So there's going to be a lot of things going on this week, but a lot of things going on next week as well. So I would encourage you to get out and to explore the web and find out what else you can learn.
Well, Dr. McAndrew, thank you so much for your help with this program and sharing your knowledge and insights and research with our families and our community members. We truly appreciate your willingness to do so. As Dr. McAndrew mentioned, this year marks a significant milestone in the fight for equality, and it is important that we pause and reflect on the process and progress that we have made and all that still needs to occur in order to make our union more perfect. I would like to also thank all of you who joined us for this program. We appreciate you taking time to learn more about this important part of our history. We'd love to see you and your family dressed in your white, gold, and purple and the flags you design about the issues that are important to you. You could have your parents share them on Twitter and Instagram using the hashtag JCU Jr. and be sure to tag at JCU Alumni in the post. Finally, we have 5 other JCU programs that might be of interest to you as well. The topics include the space industry and exploration, manatees, chemistry, poetry, and baking. You can learn more about these programs at jcu.edu/alumni. Thank you again. I wish you well as you start the school year and have a wonderful day.